Okay, so today we're going to be discussing the differences between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And so here we just have a simple line, and it's sort of the starting point of the life tree. And we can split the life tree into two parts essentially. The first part is what we'd call the prokaryotic lineage. So it's the lineage of cells, or the derivation of cells that are prokaryotic, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a moment. We can split the prokaryotic lineage into eubacteria and archaea, and then we have a eukaryotic lineage, and that's eukaryotes. And eukaryotes are all the more complicated organisms on the planet. So we're talking about animals. So humans would be included in our brackets. We're talking about plants, fungi, and protists. So a protist is something like malaria, which takes over your red blood cells, essentially. And we end up with something that looks a bit like this. And what this diagram sort of tells us is that, the idea is that all organisms evolved from a single ancestor, and then there was branchings out. And actually now, although this diagram is looks as if there's all equal amounts of bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes, it's not actually the case. Prokaryotes, so bacteria and archaea, are much more predominant. There's much more diversity of these kinds of organisms than there are of eukaryotes. We're actually eukaryotes are actually quite a relatively modern invention relative to sort of prokaryotes. I say invention, but I hope you know what I mean. Anyway, so a prokaryotic cell structure is different to eukaryotes. Firstly, so I'm just going to highlight a few features. So this inner oval is essentially the cell membrane. So that's what holds the cell together. So that's the sort of package of the cell. Inside you've got this liquidy stuff, which we'll call the cytoplasm, and that's where everything sits, all the proteins, all the DNA, all the ribosomes. And a prokaryotic cell is sort of unique because it is so simple. There's no sort of organelles. Organelles are things that have a specific function within a cell, essentially. We could call ribosomes an organelle, but that wouldn't. We could call ribosomes an organelle, but we don't have any membrane-bound organelles in prokaryotes. That's the key distinction, actually. So, for example, the DNA. So this nucleoid. So that's the main genetic information of a bacterial cell. Is just free in the cytoplasm. And that's another interesting feature of prokaryotes, actually, that their DNA is stored in a circular format compared with a linear form that we see in eukaryotic cells, like human cells, where they have linear chromosomes. Prokaryotes also have these circular things called plasmids, and they have multiple copies of these in the cell. The plasmids essentially encode things like what we would call accessory genes, so things like genes for antibiotic resistance, that sort of thing. And these guys can spread between bacteria. Essentially, bacteria can connect as if join together. Say here, this part of the cell membrane can join with another cell membrane of another bacteria, and it can pass along a plasmid. And that's how antibiotic resistance quickly spreads for a population. They also have these tail-like things, and those are important for movement. Those are what we call flagella. And then we have ribosomes. Ribosomes is where you make your proteins, i.e. is the site of protein synthesis. So then we move on to what a eukaryotic cell structure is like, and you can instantly see it's much, much more complicated. Essentially, we have all of these different organelles. So the way to remember it is it sounds a bit like an organ. So it's an organ within the cell. It's something that has a designated function. We're going to start from the center and work our way out. So right in the center, we have the nucleolus and the nucleus. And the nucleolus sits inside the nucleus. And essentially this is just where the genetic information is stored, and is surrounded by a membrane. Compare that with the bacterial cell, where there was no membrane surrounding the nucleoid or the DNA information. And then you get the endoplasmic reticulum, so this guy here. And essentially that just carries on from the nuclear envelope. And the rough endoplasmic reticulum has all of these little guys here, the ribosomes, where proteins are formed. And again, you can compare that to prokaryotes, where the ribosomes are just sitting in the cytoplasm, sitting in the liquid. rather than attach to something, which is what we're seeing here in a eukaryotic cell. We also have smooth endoplasmic reticulum. There's no ribosomes attached to that, and they have slightly different functions. You then move on, and there's these Golgi apparatus here, which just carries vesicles all the way through. You have the lysosome, and you have other things. So you have the mitochondria. Mitochondria are important in aerobic respiration. You have chloroplasts in plants, which are important in photosynthesis. I mean, eukaryotic cells have multiple levels of extra structure or extra complexity, and they have lots of different functions. This is a simplified diagram of what would be inside of a eukaryotic cell, but there is incredible complexity, and different eukaryotic cells have different properties. So, for example, in the throats of humans, we have sort of ciliated, so they have little tails which just brush along mucus. And then other cells don't have cilia. Sperm cells have little tails, which like flagella, but different flagella, so we call them undulipodia. They sort of can move sperm cell along and keep it moving. Anyway, that's the end of our tutorial on the differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells.